Now, to hear my next guest tell it, the real dirty little secret isn't only that the rich will pay, but given our increasing budget constraints, soon everybody else will too. There's just no alternative. Now, you know him as Ronald Reagan's first budget director, the financial wonderkin, the former president famously brought to the woodshed for dare questioning the wisdom of trickle-down economics. You know, he's in his young 30s then. David Stockman eventually left Washington for a long and profitable, finally bumpy ride on Wall Street. He joins me right now. Mr. Stockman, very good to have you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
So your argument is, while you're not a fan of tax hikes, we're kind of at an impasse here. There's no choice, right?
Yeah, I really share the sentiment you opened with, but I really have to dispute the conclusion because we've had a test, and over the last 8 years, and that's why I think these Bush tax cuts, unfortunately, are going to have to lapse. During the entire 8 years of the Bush administration, entitlements, $2.1 trillion a year of spending, was not touched, not a dime. We had 2 wars that we didn't pay for, a huge increase in national security spending, and even in that little area of the budget, 12% called non-defense discretionary, which is really the congressional pork barrel where all the do-gooding and meddling and all the do-gooding happens. Even there, the Republicans could not veto one bill in 8 years and raise spending, even in that little area, by 60%.
But to be fair to the former president, I mean, now he brought, talk about a guy who inherited a mess, maybe not as big a mess, but he had a recession, he had a market implosion, and then he had 9/11. But you're saying that if you were going to offer tax cuts, if you were going to try to spur the economy, you had to match them, as you said during the Reagan years, with spending cuts. Because it created deficits then, it created worse deficits later.
Yeah, I say on a long-term basis, you have to earn the right to keep the tax cut. And I say in the 8 years, really, the administration and the Congress, whoever was at fault in a partisan sense, together did not earn the right to keep these tax cuts.
Because they couldn't cut spending.
We couldn't cut spending.
But did the tax cuts generate revenue?
Yes, they may have helped the economy a little bit, but at the end of the day,
they spent that and more.
They spent that and more because now we're down to taxing 15% of GDP and spending 25%. And as a result of that massive gap, we're adding $1.5 trillion to the debt every year through additional bond issuance. The world is running out of interest or appetite.
But David, this has been, I'm not trying to play kick the can as I parodied here in the beginning, but this has been building for years. What makes you think this is the defining gospel moment?
I think because we've tried every trick there is. Last year we basically monetized debt. The Fed bought $1.5 trillion of government-backed mortgages or
to keep rates low, to force the issue.
Keep rates down. Most of that they bought from foreign holders like the Chinese, the sovereign wealth funds, who then turned around and bought treasuries. So effectively, the Fed was creating a market for the.
By the way, they were indicating now that they're going to pull back from doing that.
Well, that's what I'm saying. If the foreign sovereign wealth holders or the Chinas, the Japans of the world stop buying, the American consumer is saving a little more, but not nearly enough to make up the gap.
Wasn't that what Ronald Reagan's predecessor, Jimmy Carter, was warning about when Reagan was pushing all these big tax cuts, that eventually we're going to be beholden to the world, and that was almost 30 years ago.
Yeah, but that's just the point. It was 30 years ago, and during that 30-year period, there was Republicans controlled the White House for 20 out of the last 28 years prior to Obama.
Right.
During that entire time, there was occasion after occasion in which serious surgery could have been done on the budget. Entitlements could have been addressed. The functions and role of government in all these discretionary areas could have been sorted out. None of that was done.
So now we're at the point where unless we can't do it.
We've reached the point where I think it is exceedingly dangerous to depend on the goodwill of strangers around the world to keep buying the massive issuance of debt that's forecast in the Obama budget.
So
when I was there,
what's going to happen?
Well, I think what's going to happen is that we'll have an international crisis in the bond market or in the monetary system. Because after all, we still are the reserve currency of the world. We're pumping it out like there's no tomorrow.
When you say a crisis, like an inflation crisis, rates are going to skyrocket?
I think there'll be a crisis in terms of the stability of the monetary system, whether people want to hold dollars, whether they want to buy dollar-denominated assets. We can't predict when that will happen, the date or the time, but you know from
Within a year?
fundamental,
Within
I would
2 years?
say in the next year or two, we're going to have major problems continuing to issue federal